grandma grew up on a really a hard scrabble farm, and just learning about life on a farm in rural Pennsylvania in difficult conditions without without heat, without running water, the day-to-day labor that women really brought to the forefront. And so I just think it's a great tribute to the women in lumber and oil. It really behooves all of us to learn their stories. And in doing so, it just opens up our eyes to the depth and richness of Pennsylvania's history and its connection to the natural resources, including lumber and oil, its connection to our future. And this picturing the lessons of the day then and the lessons of today and how they apply to moving forward. So I really am going to enjoy this presentation myself, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to learn along with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Secretary Dunn. And I just also wanted to remind everyone that these presentations have been paid for in part by DCNR and their partnership grants. And it's nice because they have two heritage areas sharing one grant. So we're able to tell a lot of history about two different heritage areas. All right, so enough from us. Let's get straight to the presenter tonight to offer us the Women in Lumber and Oil. We have Hilary Jebitsch. She conducted a diversity study for the lumber heritage as part of another DCNR grant. And we are super excited to hear this story. And I know she's got some good stuff for you. So we're gonna let you begin now, Hilary.
All right, thank you, Holly. Oil and lumber heritage resonate throughout the history of Pennsylvania. These early industries brought development, businesses, income, and a variety of people into the regions throughout the central and western part of the state. Their histories and legends are marked by the stories of men, but in the background, providing support, and in some cases, working alongside of these men are independent, resourceful, and determined women. Their stories are often not told or recorded, sometimes only mentioned in the annuals of history because their acts were so outside what was considered to be the norm for a woman. In other cases, women performed their work out of necessity and did not consider it to be anything other than what had to be done. Some would probably cringe to know that their stories are now being shared, but they have become role models and figures to be respected by younger generations. Even today, their tenacity and quiet strength provide encouragement and inspiration to us. Throughout tonight's presentation, I will try to balance their stories and provide you with a glimpse of and appreciation for the histories of some of these amazing women. Lumber and oil are related industries, and there are overlaps on how women functioned in the various roles that supported them. You can see the similarities between a lumber camp and an oil lease. Both feature simple wood plank buildings, signs of their respective industries around them, derricks or trees in various states of logging, and the tools of their labor. Pictured alongside the structures are men, women, and children who lived and labored there. And you can see the women highlighted in both photographs, sort of in the background behind the men. In both industries, women worked in boarding houses and camps. Often these women were somehow related to someone affiliated with the camp or lease. They could be a mother, a wife, daughter, sister, or relative of an owner, foreman, or laborer. Women were also involved in support industries that helped to keep these establishments supplied with much needed goods and services. Local girls were hired in for help. Others raised and sold goods to women who worked in the kitchens, milk, butter, eggs, baked goods, etc. Women and girls also knitted, sewed, and created necessary items like mittens, socks, shirts, pants, and jackets, used to clothe the men who worked on the oil leases or in the woods logging. These support structures were universal in both industries. Women had distinct, albeit traditional roles in logging camps. Typically, they were present as wives and mothers with domestic roles as cooks, cleaners, and caregivers. Their children, if old enough, functioned as helpers performing basic chores. At some camps, the women came along as part of a family unit of a jobber or a foreman. Jobbers often had or hired their own crew. As a cost-saving measure, they could employ their wife and children. Widows and their children were also hired to cook and keep the camp and boarding houses. These instances were often captured in the black and white photographs of Pennsylvania's lumber camps, universal in all of the state's lumber regions, proving that women were involved in daily logging camp life. Women can be seen grouped together in the background or along the side of the woodhicks or lumberjacks. In some cases, the jobber's family or a group of children are in the center of an image surrounded by woodhicks and bark peelers, indicating their place of importance or prominence within the structure of the camp. In Pennsylvania's oil fields, women had similar roles. Looking at these images, there is little difference between a Potter County lumber camp and the Avery boarding house on an oil lease. Their roles and expectations of women who lived there and labored there in them were very similar. Understand that cooking and caring for these camps and boarding houses was not an easy task. On a basic level, the women and girls must have had the necessary skills needed to cook not only well, but in vast quantities. They would have been expected to be strong and healthy. They needed the ability to plan, multitask, be organized, and understand how to have everything properly prepared and served at mealtimes, 7 days a week, 3 meals a day. These women often worked longer hours than their male counterparts. The cooks typically woke before the men in their care to start the fires and begin the meal preparations. Before they went to bed at night, the kitchen had to be cleaned and prepped for the following morning. There we go. Some cooks hired helpers who might wash dishes, set and wait on tables, peel vegetables, wash linens, pack lunches, call the men to meals, clean tables, gather wood, and water or maintain fires. These helpers were often relatives, younger children, or help that was hired in. Seasonal chores would have included delousing the beds, replacing straw in the sleeping mats, cleaning and whitewashing the boarding house, or maintaining gardens. The women who worked in these boarding houses needed to accurately manage a budget, order supplies, and keep records. While researching through the Gibson collection at the Drakewell Museum, I read through business account ledgers for the Brawley brothers. Their 9 account books range in date from the late 1860s into the 1880s. The ledgers document their oil leases, production records, oil sales, shipping, and changes in pipelines from Clarion County to Richburg, New York. Their leases were quite successful. The Brawley brothers built, owned, and operated a number of cooperative houses or boarding houses in Campbell Station, Butler County, Duke Center, McKean County, and Richburg, New York. As I read through the pages, the names of the men who worked for the Brawley brothers were numerous, but hidden amongst the names of the men emerged that of several women, and I began to get a glimpse of the roles of their occupation and support within the boarding houses. From these records, stories of the women who worked in those support industries of the Brawley oil leases began to form. For without housing and meals, the men would not have been able to work on the oil leases. Mrs. M. Sullivan appears to have been the woman who managed, cooked, and cared for Campbell Station Brawley Cooperative House and its tenants. In the house account records and the ledgers, there are detailed expenses paid to Mrs. Sullivan for their boarding or balances on their meal tickets. Listed are the food items she acquired for the meals she prepared and served, including such items as roasts, beef, pork, chicken, eggs, butter, milk, potatoes, cabbage, onions, and beets. A line item for repairs on a sewing machine and Lido flannel and carpets and oilcloth indicate that Mrs. Sullivan was actively purchasing items for the boarding house and potentially repairing or making clothes or other fabrics needed for the boarding houses and its tenants. Throughout the ledgers, Mrs. Sullivan's work is outlined in hours and days. Her pay seems to be varied on season and year, depending or perhaps indicating a difference in the number of boarders or extra responsibilities. For example, Mrs. M. Sullivan for 4 weeks at $8 per week, labor done in June 1878, totaling $34. And Mrs. M. Sullivan, labor done from August 1st, 1878 up until September 1st, 1880, equaling 108 weeks at $3 per week, totaling $324. And you can see that on the image on the screen now. At some point, Mrs. Sullivan hired in help. Account lines state Lydia for work for $5. Lydia paid in full $20. And later, Mrs. Sullivan paid Fanny Pizer for labor $43.25. The amount of time Fanny worked was not listed. Mrs. Sullivan's accounts also indicate that she purchased goods from other women, including milk from a Mrs. Lewis and butter from a Mrs. Wheeler. Similar items are listed for Emma Brawley at the Duke Center Cooperative House in McKean County. Emma was probably a relative of the Brawley brothers. She had the same responsibilities as Mrs. Sullivan. In 1881, Emma Brawley was paid $3 per week for 1 full year of labor, totaling $156. It also appears that she acquired and purchased many of the goods needed to set up the Duke Center Cooperative House. Knowing the names of these women and the responsibilities that they performed provides a deeper insight to the countless females who appeared nameless in the oil and lumber images of Pennsylvania. Relying on their domestic skills, women continued to find employment at logging camps, on oil leases, and in boom towns during the earliest 20th century. The industrial era saw advancements in food preparation and access, which would impact the kitchens of these camps and establishments. There were also developments in logging equipment. Rail access continued to increase to more remote regions of Pennsylvania's forests. Related industries continued to grow and develop. The need for wood and oil continued to thrive. But there are stories of women who did things a bit differently, whether out of necessity or because of their own ingenuity. The image above from the Lycoming County Historical Society depicts 2 women, most likely cooks, seated on a pile of firewood. Presumably that firewood is what they would have used to heat the camp stove and to cook and heat the water and wash the dishes and laundry. Next to the perched women is a wooden milk crate, proudly advertising Van Camp's evaporated milk will keep indefinitely in any climate. The box speaks to the responsibilities in the kitchen and the remoteness of their location. Access to canned, evaporated, or condensed milk would have helped provide more diversity in the items they were able to make and serve. Fresh milk was a rarity, as access to it was limited, and the only cold storage available would have been a spring house cooled by a stream. Behind them is a large stack of hemlock bark, indicating that they were working at a bark peeler's camp. In the background, there is a young girl standing in front of an outbuilding. Next to her is another large pile of bark. Behind the women are some of the camp's building. The tall one was most likely the bunkhouse. Tree stumps and fallen trees are visible in the distance. Although the women in the photograph are not identified, there is a strong possibility that they are Idessa and Viola Rope. Around 1903, their brothers, John and Grant Rope, built a lumber camp for a bark peeling job on the Flukes Run timberlands near their home in Beech Grove, Coogan House Township, Lycoming County. Their sisters, Idessa and Viola, were the camp cooks. Laura Weaver was hired to help in the kitchen. Sometimes when the crew was extra large, their mother, Harriet, came in to the camp and helped the girls. This is another example of an extended family working at a camp. Woodlands were still visible behind the young women in the photograph. Within 10 years, the entire area would be denuded and desolate. At the turn of the century, women were still not seen as risk takers or physically capable of the same type of work done by the woodsmen. Idessa bucked the social norms of the time. The following story indicates Idessa's fortitude, strength, and independence and resourcefulness. One cold, crisp, midwinter's day, one of the teamsters came down with a severe sickness and was compelled to put his team in the barn and go to the bunk. The slide was in perfect condition and the logs were coming faster than the teams could shove them down the slide. Idessa could not allow this waste of horsepower, and against the protests of her helpers and the men alike, she dressed in warm clothing, went to the barn, and hitched up the team, and with great determination, drove the team all that day and the next until the teamster was well enough to resume his job. Idessa took matters into her own hands and prevented a loss of work and ultimately profit to her brother's business. by literally taking the reins of those horses. She would have worked side by side with other male teamsters and woodhicks from the camp. The fact that she works as a teamster, who was typically a man who would take care of and drive a team of horses used to pull logs or sleds full of logs for 2 days, indicates that she was accepted in this role by her brothers and by the men at the camp. The image on the left features a woman on an oil rig in McKeesport in 1915. She's highlighted in the box, and next to her is a gentleman. She was identified as Josephine Stocklin Junvegart. Next to that are 2 other images of her under a derrick and by the engine and the flywheels. I don't know how she came to be in that position, but it was completely atypical of the time. She is seen perched on the derrick wearing necessary clothes of an oilman. She's including the pants. Her story is yet to be fully discovered, but the image remains as a testament to her task and proof that women were involved in the oil industry history. It's also proof that there is a need for more research of women who were involved in atypical roles like this. Pennsylvania's lumber industry was not just secluded to its forests. Lumber-related industries developed throughout the region, including sawmills, chemical plants, pulp and paper mills, stave mills, shingle factories, tanneries, clothespin, toothpick, butter dish, bowl, broom handle factories, kindling factories, resin plants, toy factories, and veneer furniture factories. While the industries typically employed men, some of them also employed women. The late 18th and 19th century saw a shift from women from domesticity and domestic arts to an active role in industry. Men and women were both employed in Pennsylvania's clothespin factories. The Dodge Clothespin Factory in Coudersport, Potter County, and the Lopez Clothespin Factory in Lopez, Sullivan County are 2 examples of that. In 1900, the Lopez Clothespin Factory employed Mary Hunsinger, 20, as a turner, and Grace Carrington, 36, Maud Werkheiser, 17, Pauline Gross, age 16, and Alta Fenner, also age 16, as sitters. And Emma J. Steele, 15, did the packing. Although only a listing of names and positions, these women are representative of the roles and responsibilities that women had in the clothespin factories. These images feature the workers of the Dodge Clothespin Factory in Coudersport. The interior view of the machine room illustrates the lathes and the polishing machines that the women would have operated. Another common byproduct of Pennsylvania's forests was kindling wood. Kindling factories were common throughout the lumber and regions of the state. Typically, they were located within the vicinity of a sawmill. Kindling factories were used the leftover slab and scrap wood from those sawmills to make kindling. Much of the kindling wood was produced, then shipped to New York City and Philadelphia to use in coal stoves for heating and cooking. These images are of a large wood kindling factory in Austin, Potter County, and it was owned by the Blaisdell brothers. The photograph was taken around 1888, and a number of women are visible amongst the staff, and that's sort of the one that has the reddish tint. A period description of those who worked at the Austin Kindling Mill in 1887 stated, "There are 100 bundling presses at the factory, which are mostly handled by boys and girls in equal number from 15 to 20 years of age. These presses are worked automatically by steam screw presses with a pressure on each bundle before tying of 40,000 pounds. The pressure and release is made by a simple touch of the foot of the bundler. The gearing of the presses are made to turn 1/2 inward and 1/2 outward. The side with the outward turn being for the girls so that their skirts cannot be caught in the machinery." Think about that. So their skirts cannot be caught in the machinery. These children soon became expertly binding 700 or 800 bundles a day, each while some very expert ones with numbers, nimble ones bind it twice as many. They received 20 cents per 100 bundles, which it will be seen gives them excellent wages. This description of the Blaisdell-Austin kindling mill is incredibly telling. It subtly speaks to the dangerous natures of working in the factory. Think about the women in their skirts. The machinery, like those used in the clothespin factories, moved very fast, and there was little room for error for the young men and women who worked there. If a woman's skirt was caught in a press, the presses just ran automatically and they would not shut off. Women could be pulled into a press, causing harm or severe injury or even death. Blaisdell's bundling press invention speaks to the rising pace of industrialization in the latter half of the 18th century. Industrialization and its hazards were not limited to the textile mills and such in the big cities. They were present in the rural regions of Pennsylvania as well. The air in these factories would have been filled with sawdust. Splinters would have not just been a nuisance, but a hazard, particularly for the eyes. A 1908 account from the Forest Republican newspaper demonstrates the hazards of splinters from an accident at the Kettleville kindling factory in Forest County. Matthew Cunningham met with a serious accident on Friday. While working in the cutting room of the kindling wood factory, a splinter was lodged in his eye. A visit to Dr. Hall, eye specialist of Warren, resulted in its removal. He was getting along nicely at last report. The age and gender of the Austin kindling mill employees was also mentioned in the description of the Blaisdell mill. Boys and girls in equal number from 15 to 20 years of age. This is instrumental in visually developing and mentally understanding that many young women and girls were working in equal numbers to that of the young men and boys in the Austin mill. Their work expectations and salaries are also included. In this case, men and women appear to be paid the same rate based on the number of bundles they produced per day. Women and children were also working in Pennsylvania's oil fields. This image of oil dippers at the Miller Farm in Oil City speaks volumes. These young girls are perched by oil barrels, holding pails and a jug. A funnel rests on one of the barrel lids. Behind them are ragged tree stumps, and further back in the distance are oil derricks. Oil wells could overproduce, causing runoff that would separate and float on top of the water in nearby creeks and streams. Children would then collect the oil from the creeks by skimming it off the top of the water and then storing it in barrels, which their families hope to sell to oil buyers. This practice is very much akin to the children who would pick through the slag piles for bits of coal in the anthracite region. Like lumber, oil had many byproducts and related industries, including lubricants, petroleum jelly, gasoline, glue, and synthetic oils and fibers. Mary Alford was one such woman who benefited and prospered from Pennsylvania's oil industry. By 1899, Mary Alford was known as the only woman in the world who owned and operated a dynamite factory. In November of that same year, she was quoted in the New York World newspaper stating, "It's an odd business for a woman to be in, but I know no reason why a woman who understands it cannot manage it as well as a man." Mary and her husband Byron started their business in 1884 in Eldridge, McKean County. Nitroglycerin charges were needed to shoot wells and were in high demand during the oil boom. Several years later, Mary's husband fell ill. She had studied explosives and chemistry and began running their business. After his death in 1898, Mary took over the business, making her the first woman in the world to own and manage a nitroglycerin and dynamite factory. In addition to hands-on manufacturing, Mary managed all of the business responsibilities, including the purchasing of all the chemicals and related supplies, payroll, sales, billing, and shipping. Due to her knowledge and understanding of explosives and her management skills, she exceeded in what was traditionally a man's world. During the war efforts of the first half of the 20th century, there are few references to women working in industries related to lumber in Pennsylvania. Between 1921 and 1924, a tar refinery was built in Rolette Township, Potter County. The refinery produced jet resin, solvents, wood creosote, inhibitor oils, and guaiacol. These items were crucial to government needs for the war effort. But due to men enlisting, there was a shortage of employees. As accounted in the history of Rolette, PA, a group of Rolette women came to the rescue. During World War II, labor was scarce, and it appeared that the refinery might have to shut down. A group of roulette women heard of the problem and offered their services. After a period of training, they operated the difficult and complex process until the war ended. These women were Vera Bloomer, Litha Treat, Marie Brown, Ada Corbett, Hazel Gross, Margaret Barr, Tilly Petransky, Alice Main, Amelia Johnson, Isabel Arnold, and Agnes Franklin. It's important to say their names, to have their names remembered. These heroic women took on a mighty task and prevented the refinery from shutting down. Like other women of the era, these women assumed what were considered to be dangerous and male-dominated jobs as their civic duty to help their community and their country. During World War II in Eldridge, McKean County, women worked at the National Munitions Factory making mortar shells, incendiary grenades, thermite aerial bombs, and bomb fuses. 95% of the plant's 1,500 employees were women. That's 1,425 women and 75 men. Together, they produced 8 million devices. The conditions they worked in were dangerous, and many were exposed to TNT. Those women developed a yellow skin tone and were referred to as canary girls. In Warren County, women took on jobs at the National Forge and Ordnance Company of Irvine, the Struthers Well Corporation, and at the Penn Furnace and Iron Company Works of Warren. In Cameron County, the Shell House girls worked at the Climax Dynamite plant. The conditions they worked in were hazardous. They took precautions, including wearing special hair turbines, steel-toed shoes, and uniforms with rubber buttons to prevent static electricity. Those who worked with the TNT were required to take showers after their shifts. Their uniforms were professionally cleaned each day. Together, these women risked their health, crossed gender lines, and worked in multiple industries to help serve their country and win the war. All lost their positions or were forced out after the men returned home from World War II. But for some, the experience gave them the confidence and desire to continue to work outside the home. Before I conclude tonight, I would like to share with you 2 personal stories. Doris Johnson Versavage and Mary Bezak are just 2 examples of those women who worked in oil and lumber. They embodied grace, fortitude, and strength needed to accomplish their work. Doris Versavage's family history in Pennsylvania oil fields began with her grandfather when he immigrated to the area from Sweden after he heard of the oil discovery. When he came to America, he left his pregnant wife and 3 children at home in Sweden until he earned enough money working on an oil lease to bring them over. They had 4 more children who were born in the oil region. Her grandfather worked on an oil lease until he was killed in an engine house accident. He was actually pulled into the engine, a testament to the dangers of working with engines on those oil leases. Doris's father and 2 of his brothers also worked on an oil lease. Her mother came from Sweden and met her father in Tiduet, and they were married shortly thereafter. Doris and her twin brother were born in Tiduet on March 11, 1913, but only she survived. When she was 10 days old, her family moved to an oil lease in Triumph, located between Titusville and Tiduet. Her family went on to work as a foreman. Her father went on to work as a foreman for 42 years, but their beginnings were tough. Her father started on a pumping job, and they lived in what she described as a ramshackle house with only oil lamps for light, wood for heat, and very cold water. Her brother and sister were born there too. When she was 6 years old, they moved to a new house with luxuries, including gas light and a bathroom with a tub. Doris's mom was not healthy, and her father tried to take her out with him on the oil lease as much as he could. According to Doris, I rode in a greasy wagon boxes, and my job when they were pulling wells was to look for holes in the tubing that they were taking out. I also went with him whenever he went to oil the engines, and I knew just where to stay because we remembered my grandfather's accident. One day, one of the workers sent me to the tool shed to get a left-handed monkey wrench. I looked them all over and picked out 3 and told him to pick out the left-handed one. She said she was never fooled again, according to her memoirs. Oil was present in all facets of Doris's life. A family event would include a picnic going out when a well was being shot. Mother would pack a picnic lunch and position us a good distance from the well, and we would watch the glycerin truck arrive and watch the men getting the shot ready. We all hoped that the well would be a producing one, as it was all about the anticipation. By the time she was 12, she filled in where she was needed during the summer. She took care of their cow, chickens, and pigs and did garden work. She hauled hay and helped drive a Fordson tractor, which in order to make that work, she had to stand on one clutch with both feet to be able to jerk it into gear. She was fortunate to have attended school. She walked a mile to and from elementary school and 4 miles to and from high school. One fateful day when she was walking home from school through knee-deep mud, 2 men were driving a dump truck and they pulled over and offered her a ride home. One of the men was Carl Toe Johnson, who was brother of a good friend, and he would soon become her husband a few months after she graduated high school. The young couple were married in September of 1931 and moved into a one-room shanty with an outhouse on an oil lease on Red House Hill. 6 months later, they moved into a house on the lease. Carl worked on the lease for 13 years. They had a big garden and they both hunted. Doris canned everything she could. They also had a cow and some chickens. Doris recalled that when World War II started, they were well taken care of because they were able to make their own gasoline, meaning they weren't subject to rationing. Doris also drove a school bus during the war. Her first daughter, Jean, was born at home, and 8 years later, her sister Roberta was born in a hospital. When she was 4 years old, the Johnsons relocated to the Sand Hill oil lease near Doris's original home. There were over 100 applications for that pumping job, but thankfully Toe was hired. The family moved in December of 1944 in 3 feet of snow. In addition to taking care of their home, their farm, and their children, Doris also helped her husband with the responsibilities of the lease. Doris pumped oil, ran tractors, pulled wells, walked pipelines, wrenched rods, pulled tubes, and carried tools, and did many other odd but vital jobs on the lease. With the help of a small crew, the Johnsons ran 20 wells. Doris's responsibilities also included helping to start the one-cylinder Olin engines by turning their massive flywheels, a daunting and dangerous task. In 1952, some of the owners of the Sand Hill lease planned to sell their parts of that lease. Doris and Toe hoped to purchase 2 acres and a house. Instead, they were offered the entire lease. Without asking her husband and unsure of how to pay for it, Doris accepted this offer. She then took a job at Solar Electric in Warren and used her wages to pay for the lease. Together, Doris and Toe worked the lease until he had his first heart attack. Then it was up to Doris to keep the pumps going. Every day in the morning, at noon, and in the evening, she oiled the engines that pumped the wells. She spent the bulk of her evenings pumping off the wells before falling exhausted into bed. Due to the growing public interest in the history of oil and the oil leases in Pennsylvania, the Johnsons opened up the Sand Hill lease for tours in the early 1960s. They gave guided tours of their lease and shared their stories to the public while explaining and teaching what was required to pump wells, run engines, and walk the lines. All of these things involved inherent hazards, and from the dangers of the machinery to the wildlife and weather encountered while maintaining the lease. Toe died from a second heart attack in March 1978. Their lease was declining, and soon after, Doris partnered with the Drake Well Museum to donate some of the machinery and engines from their lease to the museum's collections. She later went on to marry Peter Rasavage. According to Doris, I have lived on an oil lease all of my life. I was born on a lease. Later, I married a pumper and lived on a lease for about 13 years. And then we bought a lease. I have pumped oil, run tractors, pulled wells, and walked pump lines and pipelines. I have lots of fond memories of growing up on a lease. Doris passed away on November 4th, 2008. Mary Bezak was born on January 14th, 1915, in a lumber camp in Dahoga, Elk County, without a doctor. Her mother, Rose Simic Yulin, had just finished preparing breakfast for the loggers when Mary was born. After her birth, her mother went right back to the kitchen with Mary in her arms to prepare lunch and clean laundry. The story of Mary's birth and that of her mother, Rose Simic Yulin, set the stage for Mary's life and her work ethic. Mary's father, Joe, was born in Austria on December 19, 1876. In 1902, he and his brother came to Pittsburgh and then Cleveland, Ohio, to work in the steel mills and earn enough money to bring their families to America. Joe returned to Austria in 1906 to marry his girlfriend, Rose Simic. The couple had a daughter, Fanny, in 1907 and immigrated to Mayberg, Pennsylvania, Forest County in 1912. Joe knew a family who was operating a lumber camp there, and together he and Rose operated a boarding house. The camp housed 20 men, and Rose did all of the cooking, baking, and washing for the family and the boarders. She woke at 4 a.m. to start the wood fire in the stove and make breakfast for the men. The hearty breakfast could include home fried potatoes, pork chops, rice, sausage, pancakes, and oatmeal. The midday meal or dinner was served at noon with a menu of beef soup, potatoes, vegetables, and home canned fruit. Supper was at 5:30 and usually consisted of some sort of meat, potatoes, spaghetti, or polenta. The meal varied each day. The men would go to bed by 9 p.m., and Sunday was considered a day of rest. The lumberjacks at the camp cut wood that was used as charcoal by a local chemical factory. When the job in Mayberg was finished, the young family moved on to another lumbering job. The jobs typically would last 6 months to a year and were located throughout the region. The Yulins had 11 children. Fanny and a brother who died at 3 months were born in Austria. The rest of their children were born in 7 different lumber camps. 7 different camps. That speaks to how much they were moving within the region from camp to camp, from job to job. In 1927, Joe took a job in North Fork, Potter County. The camp was very remote and located 7 miles back in the woods, accessible by train only. The train would come in with supplies and groceries and would leave the camp with the harvested wood. The wood was brought to the rails by horses and sleds. There were 10 camps located in North Fork that had children at them. All of them missed a year of school due to the remoteness of the camp's location. This job lasted 15 months. Only 2 of the Yulin children would go on to graduate from high school. Mary recalled that she and her siblings all helped with chores in the camps. They carried wood and filled the lamps with kerosene and washed the lamp globes. When her brothers were 8 or 9 years old, they would go out with their dad into the woods to help crosscut, split, and pile wood into 4 by 8 foot piles. They would also cut wood for the heating and kitchen stoves. The girls would usually carry the wood in with the water, and there was little time to be bored or play. If you weren't working, you were taking care of younger children and learning how to sew or crochet. The last boarding camp that the Yulins operated was in Hutchins, McKean County from 1935 to 1936. Rose was preparing dinner when she lifted a large kettle of soup off the stove. Excuse me. She was carrying it to the sink when she hit the edge of the sink and upset the soup all over herself. Mary's mother was scalded from her waist down both of her legs. This was one of the hazards of being in a large camp. She was hospitalized for 3 days before she succumbed to a gangrene infection on April 26, 1936. She would not allow the doctors to remove her legs. Women were not immune to dangers and experienced hazards of their own while working in the lumber camps or the boarding houses. After her mother's death, Mary began to work at a shirt factory in Kane. On June 20th, 1936, Mary married Joe Bezak. Joe hauled wood for the Day chemical plant in Westline. There was an opening for a boarding house in Westline, and it was the only house available. According to Mary, the houses were owned at that time by the chemical plant owners. My husband wanted to know if I was willing to keep boarders. I thought it was a good idea. Since I was raised in lumbering camps, I knew I could do the work, and it would save us a lot of time by not having to drive back and forth to Kane every day. The difference between a lumbering camp and a boarding house was whether when the lumbering job was completed. Sometimes the camps were dismantled and built in a new location. The Day Chemical Company, where charcoal was made from wood, there were several women in addition to the men who worked there bagging charcoal. It was a dirty, dusty job. And when they finished, they were covered with this charcoal dust. They looked so black that you couldn't tell who they were. Mary and Joe were supposed to move into the Westline boarding house on December 7th, 1937. Instead, Mary went to the hospital and delivered their first child, Mary Joanne. Mary was released from the hospital on December 26th and went straight to the boarding house. According to Mary, when I got home with my new baby, I found 8 boarders staring back at me as I stared back at them. I wondered what I was getting myself into. I was out of bed at 5 a.m. every morning to get breakfast ready for the boarders. Lunch was still served at noon and dinner at 5:30. Along with cooking 3 meals a day, I also did a lot of baking. I made bread, pies, and cakes. The men worked hard, and so did I, taking care of a newborn baby while cooking and doing the laundry for all of the boarders. The boarders paid 30 cents per meal if they ate. 4 of the original boarders were from Kentucky. They had a variety of positions, including a scaler, a chemist, a chemical plant workers, and woodcutters who worked for Joe. Mary went on to have a set of premature twins in 1940, Joseph and Judy. Only Joseph survived. Things changed drastically in 1942 when the country entered World War II. Several of their boarders and 3 of their brothers left to go to war. The logging industry, in addition to other industries, lost their men workers to the war effort, but this became the beginning of Mary's life in the logging world. Joe had 2 logging trucks that hauled to the Day Chemical plant, but only Joe was left to drive them. Mary decided that she wanted to drive one of the trucks. Her husband insisted it was a man's job and that Mary couldn't do it. This made Mary more determined than ever, and she learned. And according to Mary, the first day was rough. You had to manually lift the wood and pile it on the truck. My arms were so sore and ached so badly. I could hardly sleep at night. The soreness lasted about 3 to 4 weeks, and then it got better. As I'm only 5 feet tall to reach the pedals of the log truck, I shoved the seat as far forward as possible to see out of the window. I used pillows to sit on. As I also drove the school bus, my sister Gertie and Margie Patrick would help with the boarders and my children. I would leave Westline at 7:30 a.m., bus the children to the H.J. Ryan School at Lafayette, and return home by 8:45 a.m. to drive the log truck to Mead Run, where our wood job was located. Joe would have 1 truck already loaded. I would drive it to the chemical plant, unload the wood by hand, drive the empty truck back to Mead Run, and return with another load of wood. When I finished unloading, it was time to drive the school bus back to Lafayette to pick up the children, and my husband would bring in the last load of wood at about 5 p.m. Just think about the schedule. It's exhausting, and there was no margin for error. Mary had to stick to a very strict timetable to go from loading and unloading the log truck to returning to the school bus to pick up the children at the Ryan School. And if you can look at the 2 images on the screen, you can see just how much wood they had to load on that truck. And then the one that does not have them standing on it, next to the truck, you can see the sort of the cradle that they actually have to then unload those logs into. So this is tough work. Mary also learned how to drive their tractor to skid logs. During World War II, German prisoners of war were held at a camp in Redbridge, McKean County. These men also cut wood for the Bezaks during the war. At the end of the war, the chemical plants in the region began to close and their boarders began to leave. They operated their boarding house in Westline for 12 to 13 years until the Day Chemical plant closed. Rather than buy the boarding house, Mary and Joe moved to Keene in 1950. Their son Jerry was born before they left Westline. After Mary and Joe moved to Keene, Mary continued to haul wood to chemical plants in Marvindale, Sargent, and Morrison. They also hauled paper wood to the Johnsonburg paper mill. No longer having a boarding house, the Bezaks built cabins for their woodcutters to live in at their job site. They were simple dwellings that consisted of a room and a stove, a bed, and an outhouse. They had a logging job at Bloomster Hollow for 13 years, where they cut and delivered paper wood. Mary also girdled trees. This involved carrying a heavy bucket filled with green poison. Mary would use a large brush to apply the liquid on a circle around the tree. The poison would kill the bark, and the trees were treated with poison for a year. Then they would remove the bark from the tree for paper wood. Mary would drive the truckload of wood to a scaling dock, and the scaler would scale or weigh the wood. Then she would unload her wood into an empty buggy by hand. In 1958, Mary had her fifth child, Steve. She continued to work after he was born. Mary's last job was near the Nanston Hotel during the mid-1960s. She continued to girdle and poison trees for paper wood. By the late 1960s, mechanical debarking was developed and Mary was eliminated. Her own word to describe her loss, eliminated. Mary lamented as history swept away need for chemical wood, mechanical debarking replaced manual brushing, and technology developed trucks that could pull out 3 or 4 loads in one day. I wasn't needed anymore. That's what made me so mad. They didn't need me. This must have felt like a loss of identity and a place in the world to Mary. She went on to say, I have seen changes over the decades in the lumbering world. Today, there are eye goggles, chaps, hard hats, earplugs, special footwear. We had none of these. Today, there are sophisticated machinery to take down a tree, chainsaws, skidders. We used 2-man crosscut saws, sledges, hammers, horses with sleds to get the wood out. In the late 30s, my log truck's dashboard contained a temperature, oil, and gas gauge. I had a simple clutch with a hand emergency brake. If I wanted to stop, I would manually pump and pump those brakes. The back bed was a wooden rack where I manually loaded 52-inch pieces of wood, 3 racks long by 5 feet high to make a load of wood worth 2.5 to 3 cords split. My old truck had 4 tires. Trucks today have everything imaginable on the dashboard, even telephones and air conditioning. The beds are constructed of steel with mechanical loaders, and instead of 4 tires, they have 12, which can carry tons of wood on a load. What took you a week to produce in the early days of lumbering can now be accomplished in one day. In speaking with her family and in reading Mary's accounts of her life, it was clear that she felt, as she said, eliminated by modernization. But Mary went on to work and filled her life with the love of her family. From 1970 until 1985, Mary, harking back to the days of cooking and preparing food for boarders, worked as a cafeteria cook in a local school feeding the masses. Doris also went on to work in her community. She was a primary secretary for the Tituate School, served as a school director for the Triumph School District, was a tax collector and auditor for the Triumph Township, and served as the Limestone Township auditor. Both of these women served their families, their communities, and 2 of the major industries that fueled our state. Their love and their lessons continued to live on in the generations of their families. These women accomplished so much during their lives. Doris walked the lines, ran the pumps, oiled the engines, and Mary drove log trucks, loaded and unloaded them by hand. She girdled trees in preparations for the paper mill. Both women were doing these things while raising families and tackling other responsibilities. They excelled at multitasking. Their stories are unique and awe-inspiring and well worth recording. Their strength and tenacity continue to influence generations of their families today. These women challenged the norms and exceeded the odds, and I hope that they continue to inspire you today. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Hilary. What great information. I'm just going to add one more thing. Hilary did a presentation in Kane about the Bezak family, and they were there. Some of the ancestors were there, and I'm telling you, she brought them to tears. So it was great stuff. And so now Jen Burden from the Oil Region Alliance is going to read some questions that you had. And if anything else comes up, please ask your questions.
Let's start with actually the last question that Holly asked in the chat, since you have this slide up. Just to clarify, so was Mary loading this type of truck
Yes.
on her own by hand?
Yes, she was. She was loading this by herself, by hand. And then if you can see the truck that's parked next to what she called a buggy, it's that you can see the wooden slats. That's what she would then unload that 2 to 3 cores of wood into.
So she did this twice a day in between hauling kids on a school bus.
Yes, and she's only 5 feet tall. You know.
That's amazing.
Yep.
And she lived to tell the tale. I mean, that's even more amazing.
And never, by all accounts from her family, never complained. You know, this was just what had to be done.
Yeah, that's incredible. Wow. A couple other questions from sticking with lumber for the moment. What were the pay rates of women versus men?
Well, they're different. I mean, the pay rates that I have are women who are really working in sort of the boarding house aspect. I don't have all of the rates for Mary. So they're getting paid more as lumberjacks and haulers than the women who are working in the boarding houses. Their rates are certainly minuscule compared to the men's, but they're it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges because they're 2 different tasks. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about lumber camps where, and Holly brought this up, that were all male lumber camps? How did those operate, do you know, compared to when you had a woman or a family of women at the camps doing the side work?
Sure.
I was actually wanting you to kind of elaborate on how the history is told today opposed to what you're telling us now. That's kind of what I was
I mean, there's a lot of history out there that tells you that women did not work in the camps, that they weren't women cooks, that only men were cooks in the camps. And the reason that men, one of the history, well, a couple of the history citations and books that I was reading indicated quite clearly that only men could be cooks at the larger lumber camps because the women could not handle carrying larger dishes containing more food for those additional men. And that's clearly not the case. You can go through different accounts and you see women who are cooking at these camps, and the camp size will fluctuate during the time of year and depending upon what they're doing, but they can go from 20 people to 80 people fairly quickly, and you still have the same woman cook who maybe she's bringing in her mother or her sister or some other person that they can get there, but sometimes that just can't happen because they're so remote. So it's not just men, but the commonality between men and women cooks in the lumber camps is pretty clear. If you couldn't cook a meal that the lumberjacks liked, you would not last in that job. The person who was running the camp wanted to make sure that the cook was cooking food that would sustain the people who were working there. And if you did not have that skill to cook well, whether you were a woman or a man, you would be let go.
All I have to say about that is anyone who questions if a woman could carry a large plate has never met Mary Bizak.
That's so true.
Well, I mean, just listen to the story about how her mother's demise. I mean, her mother was working at a boarding house and she was carrying one of these big pots of boiling soup. and it spilled on her, and it ultimately caused her death. You know, there were accidents like that were happening to these women as well, that you don't really hear about. You might hear about the widowmaker, or the, you know, the lumberjack that gets killed because of a log falling, or having a load fall on him or whatever. But you don't really hear about those incidents for the people who were cooking at the camps, and they certainly happened.
I have a question on the oil side of things.
Sure.
You introduced us to Josephine, whose last name I'm gonna butcher, standing on the oil rig.
Yeah.
And I have seen that picture pretty much since I've been here, so it's for the past several years. And I did not know that she had been identified.
Yeah.
So do you know how that came about, of how
On the back of the photograph. I mean,
Okay.
and it's a historic photograph. In it's not modern handwriting. It's not modern ink. You know, it is there. But then there's some scrapbook pages that are also in the collection that refer to her as well. So she's identified in more than one image. But her story, I would love to research that further, because I don't know what her story is. I don't know how she got to do that. But she's clearly on a derrick. She's wearing men's clothing, which was very atypical for the time. And then there are pictures of her later on in her life where she's still involved, kind of like Doris. You know, she may have been starting the engines or walking the lines as well. But this does not seem to be a one-off. This seems to be her life.
That's great. And because that's, like I said, I've seen that image, and here in the oil region, we, within the past year, installed a new visitor center in the town of Franklin. And so we're looking for historic images to include just as background, and, you know, somewhat different ones. But we decided to include that image, even though we know a number of people have seen it, but specifically because there is a woman standing on an oil derrick, which, you know, is few and far between. And so knowing that she does now have a name, and that, yeah, we need to work on that to figure out what exactly her story was, because whatever the story is, it has to be a good one. I don't know if she can compare with Mary here.
Well, but I think there are women who have stories that are comparable. It's just a matter of having the ability to research it and find it. I certainly think the stories are there.
Hilary, in your research, I'm sorry, Jen, I just have a ton of questions because it's
No, you're fine.
I'm still learning, even though I'm lumber heritage. But my question is, during your research, in either place, and I don't think you did, but during your research, did you find any women or people, did you hear any, or did you find any accounts of where maybe a woman tried to be a man at a younger age so they could go work in either the lumber or the oil industry? Like they dressed, or they tried to act as one so they could.
Well, first of all, I should clarify, I had a lot more time to research the lumber project than I did the oil project. So that I just have to put that out there. Other than that picture, no. I'm trying to think.
I mean, she wore a dress when she was standing.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, like.
Yeah, there's accounts of women doing things that are definitely not the norm in lumber. And for Idessa, you know, I certainly get the impression she was not wearing a dress when she was driving that team, you know, with the references to her putting on warm clothes. I don't think she could have done that in those kind of skirts, not at least not safely. But no, I don't think I came across that other than that picture.
Well, I'm going to tell all the kids I meet to be a Mary Bezak because I'm still like in awe of this. I don't know how I missed it the first time you told this story, but
Yes, I'm
Wow.
trying to think. I mean, even for Rose Kajanik, who's another incredible woman with a lumber history. Um, and there were pictures of her, but she had her dress on when she when she was sawing too. Um, I'm gonna have to go back and look through my notes, but I can't think of anything right now.
That's okay. I just was curious if you,
Yeah. So I think the women are doing these wearing long skirts and dresses as well.
If anyone has any questions before we finish up here, please make sure you get them in the chat and get those posted.
Or if anyone wants to see one of the other pictures again too, I can go back to those.
This may have been said in the beginning, but where will this be archived for perpetuity? I know the Heritage offices obviously have it, DCNR will have it, but will it be at the Lumber Museum, or will it be like publicly available in the libraries or such? This is such great work, and it'd be great to have it accessible to future researchers.
Thank you. I'm actually going to turn that over to Holly and Jen because they're the ones who I ultimately give my work to.
well, so currently we have them on our YouTube channel. And so that's where they're being housed on our website and then on our YouTube channel. I honestly never thought about a written account of this, but that's probably a good idea. And on lumber side, I know that we did talk that somewhere down the road when we're ready to turn this information over, IUP actually has agreed to keep it for us and host it. So that's down the road, but yeah, it would be a great idea to get it into some other places. And I just hadn't thought about making making this live. This is the first time I'm hearing this presentation, and I agree, it's been wonderful.
Thank you.
And Jen,
And
I think you plan on doing a little bit more work if you can.
We are, and actually, Hilary, I owe you an email response, but just to let the attendees know, Holly had mentioned that that she did a diversity study with Hilary for the lumber region, and when the idea for this presentation came up, we really didn't have something to go to for women's roles in the oil region. So the Oil Region Alliance subcontracted here with Hilary to do the research for oil just for this presentation. However, we are looking to expand that in the very near future in the next grant round, actually, because there are these stories out there that just aren't being told. And first, we have to uncover them, and then figure out what is out there, and then how do we work that into our normal narrative so that we're not just talking about the same people over and over again. So what were women doing? And especially in the oil region, there was such an immediate transient turnover of people. Colonel Edwin Drake struck oil in 1859. And of course, the oil industry took off, but then as other oil fields were discovered, not only in Pennsylvania, but then across the country, those people moved. So we had this very large population that was here for a little while. And there are stories there of those people, of those families, that we need to figure out what those are and how do we get that word out. So ours is more of a work in progress, but it will happen.
Oh, and as Hilary will tell you, research never ends.
No.
So there'll be more to come. I mean, the lumber, we're already talking about doing some more research as well. So,
And that transient nature, I will say, for both, just in the small time I had for oil and everything I did with lumber, it's so inherent in both of those industries. And it's amazing to me that, people are coming from Pennsylvania for lumber all the way out to Oregon and Washington State. And then, they're working their way and they come back through Canada and they end up back in Pennsylvania. And that happens with oil too. There are stories at Drakewell that, there are families that start off here in Pennsylvania and they end up down in Texas, and, but some of them are still coming back up. And there was one account that the family brought the the wife and the daughter down to Texas, and they had a massive tornado come through, and both the wife and the daughter were like, forget this, we're going back to Pennsylvania. They never ever went back to Texas with the rest of the family. So there are these kind of interesting stories that I think will become more apparent as there's time for more research.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A or in the chat. But definitely stay tuned for more on this subject. I think in both lumber and in oil, we have more work to do in both, and plan to keep this going.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just a reminder to everyone, if you haven't signed up, or even if you have, our next presentation will be about the environmental impacts, both historically and then how we've come along today. So make sure that you tell your friends and join, and get the rest of the information. And again, anytime you want to see these, you can see them on our YouTube channel, or go to our website. So thank you so much for your time. And I know I enjoyed it, so hopefully everyone else did as well.
Thank you, Holly and Jen, for having me.
Thanks for inviting me. I really learned a lot.
I can't wait to hear more of your story about the canal. That's just another great story that we needed to add to this. So
I need to pull out the facts and research it a little bit. But I know the Portage Railroad Museum has some of my family history there because they're
Ooh,
being canal boat operators. So
I'd be interested in that.
neat.
thank you, Secretary, for giving us your time this evening, and for DCNR supporting these projects, because this is a great way to educate the masses. We know that not everyone was able to get on here, but these are being taught in schools now. People are asking us for these. So this goes a long way to do the job that we're set out to do.
Yeah, I encourage people, look back in your family history, and just learn a little bit about how deeply rooted we all are in Pennsylvania's natural resources. Really fascinating. So this is a great way to tell the story and deepen our roots.
Yeah, and stories like this we wouldn't have if we hadn't met folks who were willing to share their family's history. So there are significant stories out there. It's people that have them, just sharing them or being willing to talk. So
All right, thank you, everyone, and we'll hope to see you on the next presentation about the environmental impacts of both industries. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.